The argument I wanted to develop for you, with you, is the following. I think sustainability needs a major reframing, and I'll tell you the reasons why I think that is so, and also give you my take on what that reframing might be. And the second part of my argument is that in this new reframed perspective of sustainability, the language, the way you will communicate is through feedback stories. And I'll talk about stories, how you create them, because we know how to use them, but we don't really have skills built in how to create stories, and that's where scenarios come in. The downside of being granted an entire hour to talk is, of course, I have to use my notes because I'm not used to speaking freely for 60 minutes. And I'll start with a quote from a book by two eminent economists. One of them is George Akerlof, a Nobel Prize winner, and the other guy is Bob Shiller, famous for the Shiller Housing Index and other wonderful things. And they recently wrote a book called Animal Spirits, and on page 51 of that book they write, "The human mind is built to think in terms of narratives, of sequences of events with an internal logic and an internal dynamic that appear as a unified whole. In turn, much of human motivation comes from living through the story of our lives, a story that we tell to ourselves and others, and that creates a framework for motivation." In other words, if we don't have stories, life's just one damn thing right after another. And perhaps, certainly at my age, I've had periods in my life where that's absolutely true. Nothing makes sense. Everything is meaningless. You're young, so maybe you haven't had that feeling yet. But if you don't have a narrative to string it together, life sometimes can be senseless. Now, the good news is that we have stories already. And you've used them the very first time you met your prospective parents-in-law. You told the story of your life. You use them when you put children to bed. You use them when you write your curriculum vitae to get a job. You use them when you meet investors to have them part with their money. And even McKinsey has realized the value of a good story. In a recent article of theirs, The Dawn of Marketing, The Dawn of Marketing, New Golden Age, this is McKinsey after all, they say winning marketeers are driving growth by boosting their precision, broadening their scope, moving more quickly, and now comes the punchline, and telling better stories. This theme of the necessity of stories crops up everywhere, not just in psychology, but also in economics. And there's another great guy, Thomas Sedlacek, a Czech economist, whom I'll be quoting later on, who goes into very great depth about the value and the need for stories. And this is not just the personal, individual need. Companies, organizations, nations, and my topic today, even humanity needs a story to move itself forward. The story that we as human beings tell each other has gone through some iterations, and I'll quickly go through the first three, dwell a little bit on the fourth, and then the reframing, the fifth one, I'll talk more about. As I said, there have been four, and each story has an ideal. Each story has key actors. It has a language in which it conveys what it wants to talk about. It has behavior that drives the story forward. And it has a fuel that powers it. I see some of you writing. Anne will have copies of what I've done, so you can go to her and ask for the copy. So you can just relax and sit back and enjoy the show. The first story that humanity told itself to connect those dots, to get out of this one damn thing right after another, was the heroic one. Its ideal was excellence. The actors were heroes and adversaries. The language was that of stories. Remember the Odyssey? The behavior was competition, and the fuel was solar. In fact, if you go to the movies, this is the skeleton in which a good movie is being told today. The great storyteller of my younger days was Steven Spielberg. I'm sure you have guys that do similar things nowadays. The media still tells stories in terms of the heroic us and them. David versus Goliath. So it's not just the very far distance, it still reverberates with us today. The next one we used to make sense of our lives was the religious story. Its ideal was goodness. Actors were saints and prophets. The language are the scriptures, the holy books and prayers. The behavior is obedience, hopefully ending up with redemption. And the fuel was still solar. After that, we're now just about in the period of enlightenment, came the scientific story. Its ideal was truth with a big T, an objective scientific kind of truth. Actors were philosophers and scientists. Language was that of logic and mathematics. The behavior was that of reasoning. And the energy still was solar. In fact, being in an old university like you are being here, you live in many ways the ideal of that time. Scientific inquiry to this day is driven and motivated by that story. And not surprisingly, the biggest mistake you can make in that scientific story is to falsify your data. And I'm sure you've seen example of that already in your lifetime. And then we come to the story we live now. It's called the economic story. And its ideal is that of growth, almost at any cost. Actors are producers and consumers. In fact, they're not human beings at all. In the economic story, you're only of interest as far as you consume or you produce. And the new digital world has that driven to an incredible extreme. You're not the customer anymore, you're the product. There's a wonderful book by Jaron Lanier, I think he's called. The book is called You're Not a Gadget. It's a bit difficult to read because it's a collection of essays. He's a scientist at Microsoft, and he has a wonderful way of taking apart what this digital economy is doing to all of us. The language is that of images and numbers. In fact, that allows it to be the first truly global story. It doesn't matter if you speak German or Czech or Thai, you can participate in this story, and you do participate in this story. Because what you do in this story is to maximize your own profit. That's what drives you as you get up in the morning, work through the day, and go to bed at night. And that first time, the energy is not solar, it's fossil fuels, which in fact allows this story of growth to take place over 200–300 years. Because fossil fuels give you an energy density and an energy mobility we've never had in the history of humankind before. Another wonderful book by Václav Smil, a Czech historian from Manitoba, Energy in World History. Thin, go and read it. Let me dwell a little bit. Yes, I still have 30 minutes. Let me dwell a little bit on this story because it's the one we live. So we don't often recognize it as a story. We think it's the truth. And in fact, when you're sick and you go to the hospital, I don't know about your country, but in my country, you're treated as a potential source of revenue, not as a sick person who needs help. The question the doctor asks is, how can I maximize the revenue stream for myself and for my hospital from this sick person? You chuckle. Maybe you're too young to have experienced this. But it's the logic of the story. Hospitals in Germany have McKinsey kind of controllers that check the numbers, that reduce the cost, that drive out the inefficiencies. And it's not just healthcare, it's everything we do. Dating, when I was young, you used to have to go up to a girl and ask her. Now you can do it through the internet. And in fact, we have a dating website in Germany that claims that every 11 minutes somebody falls in love on their website. Think this one through. I mean, how do you fall in love on a website? How do they know it's every 11 minutes? It's images and numbers that drive the story. And I can go on and on and on. Taking care of old people, in my country at least, has been a profitable business. Taking care of prisoners, throwing out refugees. It's all organized according to the story of maximizing my own profit. Now, I'll stop here because you can think through examples from your own lives of how this story is all we really know. It's in our bones. It's what we're judged on, even in education. The universal education, at least in my country, in Germany, has gone out of the window with the Bologna reform. And it's only delivery of numbers that matters. But it's also a world of more unemployment, more burnouts, more precarious jobs, more substance abuse than the world has ever seen. And the question this story needs to be asked is, does living according to itself really amount at the end of the day to a good life, to a life worth living? Because that's the task these stories have. They are guidance to tell you, to give you hints as to what is a good life. I suggest to you the answer is no, not anymore. And here I want to quote Thomas Sedlacek, the author of Economics of Good and Evil, who also suggests that for a life lived for the ideal of growth, the answer is no. And he writes on his rather lengthy book on page 241, the only thing remaining for us is growth. Growth which knows nothing but itself, because it has no goal to measure. The feeling of aimlessness binds it to meaninglessness and to homelessness. And he goes on to say on the next page, if maximum growth is the imperative of our time at any cost, then true rest and satisfaction are no longer possible. Now, this is not some esoteric mystic. This is a very eminent economist who lives in our day and age in the Czech Republic. And if you have the time, I don't know if students, if you do, it's one of the books worth picking up and having a look at. And finally, for those of you, you are in an engineering school who like things a bit more concretely, let me show you one graph. And I don't know how to get rid of this Bildschirmpräsentation fortsetzen. So you'll have to forgive me. Okay. Anyway, it's small, so just be amused by it. I want to show you one graph. In fact, if you are a connoisseur of graphs, you should go on the website called The Great Acceleration. There are tons of graphs that show how things have exploded in 1950. I'll pick out one, simple one, number of people on Earth. Data comes from Wikipedia. It's probably reasonably accurate. And what you'll see at the bottom are the years from 0 to 1800. What you'll see that for a long time, nothing much happened. The number of people on this earth went from about 100 million to 2,500 million in the 1950s. A growth rate of about 0.18% per annum. And then something momentous happened. 1952, I was born, and everything changed. That's the number of people on this earth during my lifetime. The last red dot is just about 2015. I'm a little over 60 years now, so in 60 years, I've seen a growth from 2,500 million to 7,000 million. A growth rate of about 1.7% per annum. Unprecedented. And the projections are the green dots. The last one is 2050. So statistically speaking, I'll see probably one more green dot, and that's it for me. But you will see all of the green dots, and some more. And I submit to you that if you lead your life according to the story of growth, and especially when you put your children to bed and only tell them the story of growth, you will have failed them. Because growth in a world that has grown like that is no longer the answer. It's the problem. So what's this graph got to do with what I said earlier about the need for a new reframe of the story of humanity? Put some time limits on the stories that I've told you earlier. The heroic one probably happened way, way to the left, before the year 0. The religious one, I would guess worldwide, not just in Europe, was somewhere between the years 600 and 1200. The time of Mohammed, the time of Christianity, the time of Buddhism. The scientific one, the period of enlightenment, started around 1600 and went probably up to here. Whoops. And you can see that as the number of people took off, humanity needed a story of growth because it was growing like crazy. And so they invented the economic story. And if you look at the text of economics at Ricardo, at Keynes is a bit later, some of the early economists, that's when they did their thinking. And as very often, it worked very well for a while. Just like when you were an embryo, growth is a most wonderful thing. If you hadn't grown at that time, you wouldn't be here. But if at age 20 you're still growing physically, you should go see a doctor. And at my age, growth is even more ominous because growth at my age is cancer. So biologically speaking, we know how to use growth when we need it. But as a society, as humanity, all we do is ask for more growth. My suggestion to you is we need a new story. What could it be? And there are many people who warn you against predicting the future, Sam Goldwyn being one of them, who said never predict anything, especially when it has to do with the future. I will ignore that advice and tell you what I think the next story might be. And here comes the punchline. I think it will be the sustainable story. But not in the sense we're using the term now. In my lifetime, and still, I hear too often sustainable growth, green growth, inclusive growth, as an adjective to prolong that economic story 1 more year, 5 more years. It's over. I think we need sustainability as a new frame of reference. And we need a different ideal. And this is work in progress, so I'm not sure this word will actually survive, but the one that comes to my mind is resilience. And if you Google resilience, you'll find lots of entries about resilience being about being strong and withering all the plagues that maraud through the lands. I think resilience is much more of a biological term. Think of a wheat field that sways in the wind and resurrects itself after a hailstorm. Think of being sick and being nursed by your mother or by a good friend back to health. That's the kind of resilience I think will be ideal of the story to come. And it's a networked, a biological image. And that resilience is not just an individual attribute with a warrior who can't walk because he has so much protective gear, but it's a societal, it's a group image. It's an image of people working together. The actors, I think, will be learners and builders because we don't know how this world is really going to function. So we'll have to do lots of tinkering, lots of repairing, lots of experimenting, lots of failures, lots of learning. The language will be that of feedback stories. And I'll dwell Yes, in the last few minutes on feedback stories. So just let it stand here. The behavior, I think, of the future sustainable story will be that of empathetic service. And I need to add the word empathetic because service in the economic story is one of hierarchy and one of submission. I serve you because I want your money, not because I give a damn about you. In this world, you serve somebody in order to help them reach whoever they might want to become. Sounds a bit airy-fairy, but this is in fact what good parents have been doing and should be doing to their children. Not to extract their pocket money, but to help them become people in their own right. The sad thing is that even raising children in the economic story is one of what's in it for me. And not what do I need to do so that you live a contented and satisfying life. And I think the energy will again be solar. Not because we run out of fossil fuels, but because the planetary system's ability to absorb the waste products generated by fossil fuel, be that nuclear waste, be that CO2, you name it, has or is being reached. And just as the Stone Age did not end because of a lack of stones, the fossil fuel age will not end because of a lack of fossil fuels. It'll end because we've found something better. And the solar age of the future will not be one of 300 years ago where we hunkered down around a fire. We will, of course, learn 300 years of how to utilize the power that comes from the sun. But it'll be a decentralized world, helping again the learner builders to experiment, to tinker, because you don't have one nuclear power design that then sweeps the world, and if it fails, better beware. You'll have lots of little experiments, and if they fail, others will be able to observe the failure and learn from it. Let me quickly jump to the language of that future, because I need to talk about scenarios. And I said it will be feedback stories. I could talk a lot about feedback. I don't have to, because in this very building, you have a professor whose name I can't pronounce, Ulrich Goluke. Some of you may know him, who teaches system dynamics. It's one form of feedback theory you ought to learn. Not also because he's a great guy, but because feedback are a good way of representing systems that survive. You are a homeostatic system. You survive, statistically speaking, into 90, 100 years. I think that's the life expectancy at birth right now in Holland. You do that because you are capable of mitigating, of cushioning external influences. For example, you have a temperature of 37 degrees centigrade, plus or minus 1 degree to feel good, plus or minus 5 degrees to survive, regardless of whether the sun shines or it blows -5 outside. That's homeostasis. And feedback theory teaches you to understand and learn from that homeostasis. So go to Eric, sign up for his course. He teaches both undergraduate, graduate courses. And for those of you who travel from far, there's even an online version of his course. And I think he lives in, I wrote it down here somewhere, the office number. So you can actually go after this. Yeah, here it is. B2.390. That's where Eric is. Send him my regards. I don't know if he knows me personally, but I'm a sysdynamicist too. This sounds a bit silly, but it's really, really important. One of the problems with the economic story is that its intellectual foundation seeks for equilibrium solutions. Life is not equilibrium solutions. Life is homeostasis. Learn the tools that you need to interact with that life and not struggle with the wrong tool. Just like when you cut cheese, you should not use a fork. The second part of feedback stories is scenarios. And I'll rush in the last 19 minutes through the 7 phases of creating scenarios. Why is that important? Because we humans, we know stories. In fact, if you go to a children's bookstore, there are lots of stories, and even 2-year-olds can pick out whether it's a good story or not. What we lack, most of us, is the ability to create them. And you need to be able to create stories, because the stories will be fractal. You'll need to create a sustainable story of your life, of your family, of your classmates, all the way up to humanity. And scenarios are one of the tools to do that. In fact, I'm probably teaching to the, convinced, because the great inventors of these kinds of explorative scenarios is Royal Dutch Shell. They live just down the road here in Den Haag. And much of what I'll be telling you is from them. You see those snakes. That means there's 7 phases. Three of them are opening, generative, inductive phases. 2 of them are closure. And that's one of the great advantages of scenario creation. You have both. Most of the time when you do brainstorming for the future, you go into the room and you have these wonderful post-it notes, or sometimes even fancier shapes. And in little groups, you jot down all the things you can think of. And the next step then is for the moderator to stand up and say, okay, let's cluster this. And at the end of the day, they take a picture of this incredible whiteboard with all the things on the board. And everybody feels good, and nothing happens. Because all you've done is you've done the opening, the inductive, the creative stuff. And you think that's the job. You need to bring closure to this work. You need to reduce, you need to prioritize. Because if you have 50 things that are important, you'll never get them done. You need the most important, and the second most important, and the third most important, and work on it. And scenarios is one of the ways that as a group, you can find out what it is. You start with a driving question. The driving question needs to be about the future, not about the present, not about the past, because then you just find out who was guilty and who should be thrown out of the room anyway. It doesn't really lead to a good future. It doesn't lead to any future. It needs to be something that the people in the room have the power to address. Talking about world peace to little kids in kindergarten is fun, but not very goal-oriented. And it needs to be something that you really care about. You can do this already with a group. That takes time, but has the great advantage of giving buy-in right from the start. Or you can think this through in a smaller group, but then you have to spend time to convince people that you actually came up with the right question. Start with a driving question. Don't skip this. If you make a mistake here, much of the work later on will not have any grounding. The second one is interview folks. And in large scenario projects, the ones that Shell does, they talk to about 100, 200 people, one-on-one, to find out what their hopes and dreams and concerns related to the driving question that you've come up with really are. Tape their answers, because you need that later on in your analysis, and listen to what people have to say. These are open-ended questions, so that's why I also said conversations. They're not interviews in the sense of having a checklist and you tick off what people are saying, but you give them room to air what concerns them. Lately, I've been doing a project down in Aachen, across the wonderful province of Limburg, with school children, kids 15 and up. And of course, there you don't talk to 200 people. There are ways that you can reduce the effort and the time, if you don't have the resources, to bring this down to a manageable number. And even within a classroom, you can do wonderful interviews and wonderful analysis. Beware, though, that as people get older, the harder it gets. School children are great. 50-year-olds in a group setting are awful because they're constantly monitoring what it is that is being said. And why is he saying this? And how come she is not participating? And they spend about 90% when they're in a room thinking this through rather than being creative or saying what is on their minds. School children are different. There's an initial resistance that a grown-up wants to know what they're thinking because they don't believe you. They think you're full of you-know-what. But once you've overcome that, they fly. They really do. So when you do scenarios, always have school children as part of your group. And sometimes skip the old ones. And I'll have to tell you a little anecdote. Shit, I have to speed up. We did a project also in Aachen about the region, and there was a 14-year-old in the workshop, and in the beginning you introduce each other because you're together for 3 days and so forth and so on, and everybody says how wonderful they are, and usually old people don't say anything about themselves. They talk about the function. I'm the mayor, or I'm the whatever CEO of XYZ, and I'm important. And she got up and said, looked around and said, contrary to most of the people in this room, I will actually live in the future we are discussing. And you have to have this kind of input every once in a while to put people down back on earth. Next phase is the analysis. You go into a room with 2-3 people for a weekend, listen to the, look at the transcripts of what's been taped. There are also ways of automating that. The big problem in this phase is to really hear what people are saying. Look at the answers, jot down a concept of 2 on a post-it note and begin to cluster it. That is then being fed in to the first workshop where you come up with the 2 most important and most uncertain drivers of the future in relation to the question you asked way at the beginning. Uncertainty, let me add one word here, is incredibly important. In our culture, we don't like uncertainty. And if we find it, we pretend that there isn't. And then we invite an expert who pretends that there isn't. If you don't have uncertainty, you have no power. You need the uncertainty to have a leverage point to enter into the system to make it go one way or the other. If everything is certain, all you can do is sit and wait till time passes you by. Next comes the story creation, often done in workshops, where you arrange these uncertainties in axes, horizontal and vertical. You have 4 worlds, and you go into the worlds And as we say in German, you give your monkey sugar. You really let your creative spirits flow. Once that's done, and you need usually 2 workshops for that, you can then apply the stories to the question you asked in the beginning. And I put it in blue because this is one of the things that Shell doesn't talk about. This is when the strategic conversation starts to happen about what it is, how you reallocate resources differently, how you change your life, how you become a monk, and so forth and so on. And if you don't do that, what you're left with when you do scenarios is often this funny feeling that you have great stories, but you don't really know what to do with them. And if I have, I'll do it, 30 seconds. You analyze the stories by, of course, the stories at the top. You have 4 worlds, and the options that you come up with. Options are actions, plans, resource allocation, investment decisions, decision to study one thing or another, choices of future spouse, you name it. And you evaluate that option in each world, one by one by one. You can do this emotionally, you can do it by SWOT analysis, depending on who you are and what your, how should I say, inclination is. And you say it's either very positive, 0 means it has really no effect one way or the other, minus means it's negative, and double minus is it's awful. This is a very time-consuming part of the job, but it should be done. And the adapters will then analyze this matrix by row. Adapters are people who take the worlds as given and can only adapt to it. Meaning, if you're not very powerful, you're an adapter. You have to be an adapter. And you can say, option 3 is one that I should be doing, or option 2 is one should I be doing, or option 5 is one that I should not be doing. So you have clarity, you can prioritize the options that are at your command. If you're very powerful, if you're a multinational corporation or the president of a university or the head of a family or whatever, you analyze this, and there should be something coming up, by column. You ask the question, which world is really the one I want to live in? And if it's world D, what do I need to do in order for D to become more likely? Who do I need to make coalitions with? And the options on the left-hand side, in this perspective, become variables. So it's more difficult to do, but much more rewarding to do. The time is up, I'm afraid. As I said, Anne, who is now gone for some reason, there you are, has both the handout as well as probably I'll give her what I talked about. There's some links in there, so if any of this is of interest to you, you can talk to Anne, you can talk to me, go to Eric, you can dwell on this. One final note is, I talked about this project we have in Aachen. When we teach teachers to do scenarios with their kids, we need 3 days, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, in order for them to go through this process once and to get enough knowledge once and courage to go back into their classrooms and do it all of their own. So if groups of you are interested in learning this, you might want to think about a 3-day workshop. There are folks here in Holland who do this. If you're interested, I could come back and do this. But if you really want to learn how to do scenarios or get a job at Shell and learn how to do it there, it's a key tool you'll be needing in a truly sustainable world, because it's a tool that allows you to communicate what the new world is all about. And with that, and with only 5 minutes overdrawn, I need to end. Thank you very much.